around the corner. So it's
Okay, yeah, perfect. Okay, should I start?
Yeah.
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 You guys want to... Are you taking notes?
I'll take some notes. Yeah.
Okay, and Serge... Okay, yeah, he's also taking notes.
I actually want to take notes too.
Okay.
Okay, lovely, perfect.
Do you have a title for your...
Capitalism and climate change.
Nice.
I also have like some subtitles for the sections, but I'm not planning to... I can just read them if you want, just for the sake of clarity.
Yeah, that could work.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. What could be quite interesting at some point is after today is if you could scan them or get them all into a PDF, and then we'll upload them into like a work folder.
Yeah,
so
sure.
you can download them.
Sure. I already have it as a Google Doc. Like I just printed this today.
Oh,
but it's primarily as a PDF document I have.
Perfect.
So
Cool.
I can just send it over if you guys want.
That's
Perfect.
enough.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. Man.
Okay. Should I start?
Yeah.
Yeah,
When
ready?
you're
Yes.
ready.
Okay. Climate change, ladies and gentlemen, is no doubt one of the most pressing existential threats of our time. No longer a distant possibility thrown around in board meetings and dismissed by CEOs. Rather, now an active phenomena felt by hundreds of millions, if not billions, worldwide. We see the consequences of it through, for example, record levels of melting glaciers, among other causes leading to a staggering 10-centimeter rise in ocean levels. And for context, the tide in Gothenburg, that is plus minus 8 centimeters. So aside from the tide, we have an additional full-on permanent tide right now because of climate change. Along with, for example, massive spread increase in wildfires. From the 80s, we used to have approximately 3 million acres of wildfires a year. Now we have over 8. So basically, within 40 years, the amount of wildfires has practically tripled. We also see, starting since the 80s, every single decade has recorded more hurricanes than the past, causing more devastation. Every single decade has recorded more hurricanes than the past. Now, as we see all of this taking place, the world is facing irreversible damage. But it's important to keep in mind, this damage, while irreversible, it is preventable damage. However, the preventable part from this clause rests upon two conditions. Those two conditions being, one, the complete and thorough analysis, hence understanding, of the root causes of climate change. It is in trusting and listening to experts who have dedicated their lifetimes to understanding how this is happening. And they've developed plethora of tools and strategies to mitigate these faults. But more importantly, the second condition is the willingness and ability to actually go through with these strategies that the experts laid out. It is the ability for us to listen and hear these experts and what they're saying, for their voices to not be silenced. The democratization of the world in a true sense. Now, unlike the current supposedly democratic system, which continues to ignore the voices of the masses, this... Okay. Yes, this is what needs to be done, true democracy. And this is the goal of our party, being the overthrow of capital and capitalism and the establishment of a socialist workers' democracy. Now, so these are the two conditions. And now, I'm going to say something which might come off as being surprising to some of you, but I assume that most of you will just find it as common sense. It is that the first condition has already been met. 40 years ago it was already met. We've got thousands of lifelong experts all agreeing with each other. We've got libraries worth of research and academic books and papers and studies. We know what's wrong, we know how to fix it, we know what is to be done. In fact, we've known what is to be done already since the 70s. The reason it's not being done isn't because we don't know what has to be done. It's because there's a clear, distinct class of us. People who are separated from us, the common working people. And it is those people whose interest is in continuing this massacre happening against our planet. That is why we're not going through the changes that we already know need to be done and we already know how they're to be done. It is those people, this class of elites, sitting their asses in boardrooms, discussing how they can make a few more billions by shaving off some unnecessary expenditures on climate. It is that class of people who sits and discusses how do we market and advertise to convince the people that, oh, trust me, bro, one more lane will fix traffic. It is those people that are the root of the problem. And you will often hear the problem being with consumerism and, oh, consumerist culture, it is the, like, people are buying and wanting too much. And this is where it's important to keep in mind. Nobody wants to have to buy a new phone every 2 years. Nobody wants to go on a road with 12 lanes. It is not the people who want this. It is by design the capitalist corporations that have what's called, among many other things, just as an example, planned obsolescence, where they want you to buy more shit. They don't care if it makes your life any harder. They don't care if it pollutes the planet. They want you to buy more shit. The whole way in which we measure success of an economy is through GDP. What is GDP? GDP doesn't measure how much healthcare we have. GDP measures how many times the same amount of money goes around. We measure economic wellness by how ineffective the economy is. That is the problem of capitalism. So whenever you hear about the problem of people being consumerist, keep in mind, it is not the people. It's the people sitting in boardrooms that want you to be consumerist. There's a reason why people have been trying to push for what's called the right to repair in the EU for a long time. It's because the people want it. The people know that it's right and the people want it. But there's also a reason why that law hasn't been able to be achieved in the EU. And it's because everyone at the top, the elites who are profiting, for example, Apple, again, not to focus on Apple specifically, but just as an example, they don't want the right to repair. They want to sell you a new phone every 2 months. Because they make money off it no matter how much of a hell it makes your life or the planet. So ultimately it is those rich hence powerful, and to clarify, not rich and powerful, rich hence powerful, it is them who don't want this kind of laws. So ultimately, yes, while there is a problem with consumerism, don't let anyone fool you into thinking that it's the fault of the consumers. It's a deliberate scheme by the very specific group of people who are benefiting from these consumerist ideas. It is the capitalist class, to be specific. Those who profit from the system of capitalism and perpetuate it, despite having been scientifically proven faulty and inefficient time and time again. It is precisely this class that has drowned these facts and has admittedly spread thousands of lies, killed tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, for the sole purpose of deliberate, massive worldwide propaganda perpetuating capitalism, convincing the people that socialism and communism are actually bad for you. The right to repair is actually bad for you. It's oppression. Freedom is slavery, as Orwell put it. And again, trust me, bro, just one more lane will surely fix traffic this time. So let's talk about capitalism. And this is the second section. Capitalism, how did we get here? Right, okay. So to understand how we arrived at this point, we must first understand capitalism itself. Capitalism is, by a huge margin, leaving any comparisons obsolete, the dominant system across the world. So what is it and why is it so dominant? So capitalism, at its defining core, is an economic system that champions the right for private ownership of the means of production, i.e. the private ownership of big companies, factories, banks, land, and so on. It is a system primarily divided in two classes. Those who own capital, hence can employ others to work for them. Those who own no capital, hence are forced to work at other people's capital. They're employees. They work at wage labor. In other words, the people who are forced to sell their labor and nothing else. So this leads to a clear distinction between those two people. Now, profit is generated by capitalists by providing their employees wages lower than the amount of value these employees generate. And this is where we can see a clear contradiction, or not necessarily a contradiction, but the emergence of the first failure within capitalism. It is in the sense that employees, the rate of their wages is fixed. One employee gains this much amount of money for this amount of work, whereas the capitalist, they can keep employing more and more employees, and their profits will keep skyrocketing. So in one sense, you have one class who is the majority of people, they cannot gain any more money. They're limited in how much wealth they can amass. And then you have another class that is by definition exponentially growing and accumulating wealth and more wealth. The capitalists, they're not putting any of their own work, they're simply making money off of other people's work. While one person is forced to sell his labor to stay alive, one person is gaining from the labor of all others. And now, due to the competitive market of nature, the way in which the free market fundamentally works under capitalism, all capitalists will try to, and in fact have to, try with all means at their disposal, in any way they can, have to drive towards more profit. Because if they don't have more profits, they will be outcompeted. That's the fundamental idea of competition. So these capitalists have to prioritize profit above all else. Ultimately meaning that this is a system which rewards and prioritizes whoever is better at exploiting their workers, whoever is better at stealing from their workers ultimately. This is the first fault, fundamental problem within capitalism. There's many more, I'm not going to discuss all of them, but this is important to understand the clear distinction between the capitalists and the workers, the proletariat. And so, okay, well, I was planning to have a much longer section here, but Nikki advised me against it because it's a much longer topic that I can't really summarize into just this short period. So instead, I'll just summarize quickly by saying, among the many crises that emerge from capitalism, one of the many problems is the commodification of everything. For markets to work, for to have a free market that can control the economy, everything must be treated as a commodity. This is the problem of commodification. We see things like across the board being treated as commodities. The most pressing examples are food and healthcare. Now, we all hear about this idea of supply and demand and how the invisible hand will always get us into an equilibrium. And hooray, how much we love capitalism, the free markets, and equilibriums and supply and demand. But if you really think about it, the whole idea of supply and demand rests upon the assumption that whenever something is more expensive, people will not want it anymore. And whenever something is less expensive, people will want it more. But if you think about that for a second, that is objectively, factually incorrect when it comes to things like food, medicine. No matter how fucking expensive bread is, people are gonna need to buy bread, or else they fucking die, you know? So this whole idea that, we can treat everything as a commodity and let the market, invisible hand deal with it, it's objectively, factually wrong. And especially when we look at healthcare, one of the problems that arise from this is that since the quantity in the market does not respond to the price, as capitalists will try to claim, what this means is that it allows the capitalists to set whatever fucking, extravagant prices they want, and they can get away with it. They can set medicine that costs $2 at the price of $700, and people are still forced to buy it just because that's the way it works. And then you'll hear neoclassical academics, capitalist apologists, they will come and tell you, well, actually that's wrong, that doesn't happen because competition. If a company tries to sell it for $700, another company will sell it for $650, and hence the price will keep dropping down. Well, why does that not happen in the real fucking world? Look at insulin selling for $600 a vial. The reason this doesn't happen in the world is because, well, the whole idea of the free market, it's liberal naivete. It assumes that everyone will act independently in good spirit, which is fucking not true. If you look at the real world, I have an example here now. Let me, if I can find where in the paper I am, just to mention the exact numbers, the exact example. Okay, I can't find it. But Pfizer and two other companies, they were found, documents were found showing that they were colluding together, determining to set prices together, pricing strategies, which inflated the price of medicines by more than 200 times. We have evidence showing it, their own internal documents. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is facts. That's the competition of the free market we live in. And then, now, we also, whenever we talk about capitalism, aside from the problem of commodification and how companies can set the prices on food and medicine so high, there's another problem that's common in capitalism, and this is more in topic with what we're discussing today. The idea of what's called a market failure of externality. And I want to clarify first, when capitalists refer to this thing as a market failure, there's an implicit assumption here. They're claiming that this notion in itself is one that we reject. Because when you refer to the fundamental crisis of capitalism, when you refer to it as a market failure, that is implying that the market otherwise is functional and desirable. And that by working towards eliminating these market failures, it is assumed to be self-evident that the market, when works undisturbed, will be good. This is wrong, and this is what this whole speech is about, to clarify that these so-called failures are not individual mistakes that happen in capitalism, they're the design of capitalism. So let's talk about what actually is this market failure. This is what's called the failure of externalities. This is, for example, when there's a part of the market there's a part of the real world that is genuinely costing society and everyone, but that cost is never being reflected in the actual market. This is when we come to pollution. If we look at, for example, the pump jacks that are digging up oil, they're not having to pay for the CO2 called like the carbon dioxide that's being emitted. And when the pump jacks sell their crude oil to oil refineries, no one there is paying for the pollution. And when the oil refineries sell their cracked oil to chemical plants to make plastic, they're not paying for this called carbon dioxide. And when those plastic things, companies sell it to Coca-Cola or whatever, no one's there is paying for the carbon dioxide. So who is paying for it? Nobody. What that ends up is, we end up in a situation where there is a real cost to a society, but it is never reflected in the market. So even if you want to agree with the idea of the supply and demand and all that, even by that own logic, even by that own theory and model, there's an added cost that is never reflected in the market, so the market will never land on an equilibrium that is the true equilibrium. Now again, capitalist apologists will say, oh, there's an easy way to fix this, or actually it's not very easy. They would bitterly have to admit that to fix this we would need government intervention, we would need to set a tax equal to the approximate cost of the pollution. That way the cost on the producers will be the same as the cost to society. It's a bullshit idea, but let's humor it for a second and see where does that lead us. Leads us fucking nowhere. No, I can go for a long time explaining why this doesn't lead anywhere, but ultimately just keep in mind, what this is saying really is, one, let's treat the climate as a commodity and you have to pay to pollute. I think we can all here instantly see why that's a fucking stupid idea. Second of all, even if that was not a stupid idea, that doesn't happen to begin with, because capitalists will never let such regulations go forward. And this is where the third failure of capitalism emerges. The fact that with capitalism, wealth is directly correlated with power. The capitalists, they own the factories, they own the farms, they own the houses. If I can't go to work anywhere, if I don't have a place to live, if I can't eat food to live, I'm gonna fucking die. In other words, everyone is forced to submit to the capitalists. Capital, by definition, fundamentally, is correlated with power. Wealth is power. Hence, it doesn't matter who you vote for at the ballots. It doesn't matter what you vote for. Ultimately, the true power in society is within the capitalist class. This is why carbon taxes, first, will never be placed. And even if they were put in place, they can simply be dodged and avoided, as we see already everyone, like all the capitalists, dodging all the taxes. So this idea of government intervention simply does not work. Now, from defining principles, allowing for and championing the private ownership of capital, yes, right, I already said this. Okay. So yeah, this is why, again, the will of the people, no matter how unanimous, is never reflected in policy. In other words, no matter how seemingly democratic and free the elections are, in reality, it is always capital which dictates policy. So let's look at this in practice, specifically with the topic at hand now, climate change. So let's start from the Industrial Revolution onwards. Capitalism has fueled the rapid growth of industries that have had horrific impacts on our planet, starting in the 19th century with coal. Coal was the backbone of Western industrialization and economies, and coal barons quickly became among the wealthiest people on the planet. It is estimated that in the UK alone, you can tell us a lot about that later, coal consumption went from 24 million tons a year in 1825 to 140 million tons in 1873. 140 million tons in 1873. Now, keep in mind, unlike modern climate change, Coal has had very direct and sensible impacts on the environment. The air in London was infamous. Everyone living there knew what was happening. And as Joseph Conrad wrote already in the 1890s, he wrote, the air was dark above Gravesend, the name of the town he was in. And farther back, he described the air, still seemed condensed into a mournful gloom, brooding motionless over the biggest and greatest city of earth. This is already in the 1890s, Joseph Conrad, one of the greatest writers of all time, describing the air above the town he's living in being dark, motionless, gloom. This and also along with this, now after these effects were already noticed by everyone, after the air was already described like that, that didn't stop the capitalists. Coal consumption continued to grow from 140 million to 292 million in 1913. After this shit was already being sensed by everyone, the air was genuinely unbreathable. Coal consumption still doubled after that. And this is why the disease known as bronchitis, when the lungs are inflamed, actually became known, and newspapers would refer to it as the English disease. But the capitalists didn't fucking care. They continued to push for more coal, as is normal. Now, the consumption of coal did curb after a while, but that wasn't because the capitalists are so kind-hearted. It's only because they found a more profitable alternative to coal. And this is when we come to our beloved baby boy, oil. The rise of oil was even more rapid than coal. From 2,000 barrels to 4 million within one decade, and then up to 130 million in yet another decade. Exponential, immense rise in consumption of oil. That is in the US alone. Soon and quickly, oil companies became de facto the most powerful entities in the world. Now, the tale of John Rockefeller, John Davison Rockefeller, you probably all heard of it. His corporation, Standard Oil, is an infamous one. Where through collusion, corruption, exploitative contracts, so on, he became the most powerful man in the US, and many people would argue the most powerful man in humans' history, period. Now, many people may also know him as a philanthropist who funded a lot of education, but what people often don't know is that the education he funded, there are internal documents citing that the reason he funded these educational programs, quote, to prime docile workers. This is the most powerful man in the world, who many know him as a philanthropist who funded education, admitting the only reason he's funding education is that it will prime docile workers to give up their labor power to make him richer and wealthier as a man. And then after a while, the descendants of that company, such as ExxonMobil, along with many other companies, are still the most powerful entities in the world. Now, but as these firms were growing, so too was the evidence and the pushback against them from academia. In the 1960s, countless experts, including James Hansen, a NASA climate activist, started sounding the alarms, started realizing that permanent, irreversible damage is being done to the Earth ecosystem and the atmosphere, with rising CO2 levels, among many other things, like that result of oil. And the oil companies were not oblivious to this. They knew this was happening. We have documents back to the early 70s showing that ExxonMobil, along with many other companies, their own researchers knew that this was happening, and they had accurately predicted the devastating effects, even more so than the NASA researchers. ExxonMobil knew exactly what was happening, and what did they do? Bury the research. And now ExxonMobil, along with many other companies, weren't just content with simply burying the evidence and the research they found. Instead, they went as far as to spend millions of dollars funding massive misinformation campaigns, founding what's called the Heartland Institute, which is still active today. An institute which says it is a not-for-profit institute aimed at discovering, developing, and promoting free market solutions. Solutions to what? They never clarify, they just say that. Lovely. Now, what that institute has done is that it has hired 700 researchers who became among the most cited in the world, who were spreading objectively, factually, misinformation regarding climate change. Claiming, for example, that, global warming wasn't real, or that even if it was real, it has nothing to do with the oil, it's probably the birds or something. I don't fucking know. Pure bullshit. Hundreds of millions spent influencing and dictating policies. by the Heartland Institute. And as more and more regulations were placed to aid these companies, any regulations that tried to stop them were just stalled and basically stopped. Right. And now, this all might sound like a ridiculous thing of the past, but this is still happening. As recently, just 2 weeks ago from today, on the 7th of October this year, like 2 weeks ago, BP, one of the largest oil companies in the world, just announced 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago actually, that they're abandoning their climate goals for 2030. Mm-hmm. Less than 2 weeks ago, they just decided, yeah, fuck that, we're not gonna care. Just last year, throughout 2023, the reason I'm saying last year is because we don't yet have the data for this year, but this year is probably much larger. But just last year, $4.3 billion, that is 10 times the GDP of Sweden, was spent on influencing policy in the US alone. And this is what I mean when I say it is not the vote of will of the people, no matter how unanimous that dictates policy. It is capital. 4.3 billion people, 10 times the GDP of Sweden, is what dictates policy in the US. Now, under capitalism, as wealth always accumulates and centralizes, and as wealth directly correlates with power, the wealthy can and do, in fact, intervene to stop any regulation that will slow down their growth, no matter how necessary for the climate and Earth. And they will continue to drill, baby, drill, as Trump has said many times. And he's now parroting it out loud. He's not even hiding anymore. And this is a really funny thing. We saw this actually. We heard it a few weeks ago in the vice presidential debate with J.D. Vance saying like, "Oh, even if..." Well, initially he was skeptic about climate change, but then he said, "Even if climate change is real and all that, doesn't that only mean that we should actually drill more in our land? Drill, baby, drill." That is in the vice presidential debate. He's saying that shit. And just to clarify, yes, it is just as ridiculous as it sounds. It's fucking nonsense. And it's being spoken on behalf of half of the population. This is what we live in today. Now, it's important to keep in mind and understand, when I'm speaking right now about individual examples, I do not mean this as an individual critique of those individuals. To clarify, it is indeed a critique of those individuals, but more accurately, it's a critique of the system in which they live. To clarify, John Rockefeller, he wasn't an inherently evil man. He wasn't born with the evil gene or whatever. God didn't talk to him and tell him to single-handedly drill 9 times more oil than everyone else at his lifetime did. He didn't do this out of personal evil. Rockefeller was simply acting in accordance with rationale within the context of capitalism, the system he was in. All of these occurrences that I've talked about are not individual faults of the system, rather are fundamental intentions by design. Capitalism says, let the entrepreneurs do what they want, and let money play its course, and let the free market determine the path forward. And, obviously, funding misinformation campaigns sure as hell is part of the free markets. So that's how we go forward. So capitalism, by definition, as I've said before, it rewards those who are better at exploiting, those who are better at working, lying, and those who are better at being corrupt and collude and so on. So capitalism, in its essence, yes, and so by induction, to expand more rapidly is the goal of competition. And capitalism, in its essence, necessitates this drive for profit, regardless of the cost to human lives, the future generations, or the planet. So recently, there has been a growing trend towards green capitalism. The idea that we can take green strategies or policies, regulations within the capitalistic framework to better protect our planet. Championing technological innovation and progress and all that. And now, whilst we absolutely agree that technological innovation and progress can indeed help lift the toll of the environment, the idea that we can fix climate change within the capitalistic framework is simply put just a naive idea. As with the example I just provided earlier with PP literally just deciding to abandon their climate goals. I already talked about this. Yeah, so the idea of green consumerism, encouraging consumers to buy an eco-friendly product such as electric cars, in itself is another huge facade. It is a straw man. One might think that these are environmentally friendly, but in reality, it's only pushing the cost on the climate one step further from us, making it harder to see. So now, instead of seeing the CO2 in the air as a result of the oil from cars, we see the fucking mines in Australia mining for all the lithium going to absolute shit, looking absolutely apocalyptic. It's insane. So externalities in the form of pollution that are added cost to society, as I've discussed earlier, are not taken out of the picture. They're just being placed somewhere else so we don't see them. The fundamental idea that there's a cost to society that capitalism can never account for is still there. So the fundamental concept, the fundamental problem with these concepts of green consumerism is that while we do have green technology, this green technology is more expensive than the currently available technology. This green technology requires money to be put into researching it. And the problem there is that any company that tries to research green technology, by definition, will be outcompeted. The capitalist market necessitates the drive for profits. If one company is profiting less than another, it will simply be outcompeted. If there is a mine in Australia that you can use and it will give you money, no matter how much it pollutes, if a company decides not to exploit it, another company will come and exploit it, and that company will grow larger and more powerful. So by definition, under capitalism, you must exploit as much as you can, pollute as much as you can, otherwise you will be competed out. That is the inherent fundamental problem within capitalism, well, among many other problems within capitalism. So to reiterate, the problem is not our current technologies, nor is it individual bad actors. The problem is a fundamental system that does not care about the planet. A system that sees resources ripe for extraction and goes to town, ignoring all ecological effects thereof. The solution is clear. It is a move towards democratization, real democratization, a revolution overthrowing capital and instating a workers' democracy. Where decisions aren't made in some board meeting discussing how to increase quarterly revenues, rather by the workers, me and you, everyone, discussing how to make lives for everyone better. That's how decisions should be made. This is the change that we need. A step away from centralized, accumulated capital dictating policies in the hands of a few, making decisions with the sole purpose of increasing their wealth, to a democratically planned economy, where the means of production belong to those who work them. This has to be done via the forced expropriation of banks, oil companies, housing conglomerates, automobile industries, and so on. Making them under public democratic control, where decisions and investments are made in favor of the working people and the planet, not in favor of profitability. And now the third section is change, moving on towards a better society. Now, it is important, in fact crucial, to understand that change is not only necessary, but is in fact entirely possible. We don't accept the common doom and gloom, defeatist sentiment that commonly exists online among modern day liberal left, because the solutions already exist, so we don't accept a defeatist sentiment. Instead, we say the solutions are within reach, awaiting to be implemented, if only we awaken and channel our collective will to fight for a better world. The industries our economy relies on today are largely responsible for the environmental destruction we face, but they don't have to be. The path forward involves transforming our industrial sectors to operate in service of the people's demands, in harmony with the planet rather than against it. This means, in many aspects, fundamentally rethinking how we produce energy, manufacture goods, and build infrastructure. But in many other aspects, this means not needing to fundamentally rethink the processes. Instead, simply realizing what we already want and have been trying to achieve. So many ideals that we've had for a long time and have been striving for, we just need to achieve them. We don't need to rethink everything. There are so many ideals that we already have that we're simply locked away from because of capital, not because we don't like those ideas. For example, just as an example, renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and geothermal, they are no longer futuristic ideas you see in cyberpunk movies. They are already here. They're proven to be effective. They're proven to be functional in every sense. more green, and everything. The existing technology is capable of powering entire cities and even countries. Take Denmark, for example. More than half of all of Denmark's energy is wind. We already have that technology. Now, the efficiency of solar panels from 2009 to 2021, so in 12 years, went up by more than 5 times, making it, in many places of the world, cheaper than oil. Yet, it is still not being used. Why? Because more expensive energy means more profit for the rich. This is where we live. So the problem isn't feasibility or possibility of the transition towards green energy. The issue is that parasitic capitalistic system does not want the transition towards green energy. Again, because more expensive fuel simply means more profit for them. So under a democratic, socialist, worker-controlled economy, the expansion and transition towards green renewable energy infrastructure that doesn't poison the planet is not only possible, but will probably be among the first things to happen because everyone already wants it. The only reason we can't achieve it yet is because capital wants profit, so they're locking us away from it. So, similarly, we must invest in many more things, such as circular economies and industries that are designed to minimize waste. For example, second-hand, repairs, and so on. Instead of the planned obsolescence that we see in our industries today, we could, as we did, and we can do again, produce products that are built to last. Systems that allow for easy repair, that allow for reusability, and that are simply better for the consumer. This shift would not only reduce waste and pollution, but it would also make the lives of the workers easier, cheaper, along with opening the doors to innovation and engineering ingenuity. So, science and technology have always been among humanity's greatest tools, but under capitalism, research is limited by profit motives, where, for example, pharmaceutical companies develop drugs not based on the people's needs, but based on profits. Energy companies fund research to find new ways of extract oil, instead of paving the road towards transitioning from it. Under a worker-controlled society, this would never last. We would see the public unanimously agree that this is unacceptable. And instead, we could pivot all of our research to the development of green technologies that actually serve society as a whole, serve the workers, and again, in harmony with the planet. Take electric vehicles, for example. EVs for short, I'll be referring to them as EVs. We already have the technology allowing for significant reduction in the carbon emissions of transportation. But even within that sector, there is still so much potential that is to be achieved. Compare the typical American EV with the typical Chinese EV. And you will find that the discrepancies are staggering. Public research by the Chinese government has led to such immense progress with EVs from China, matching qualities and features of American ones, costing less than a fifth, and requiring less than a third of the lithium. Yet, American companies refuse to allow these Chinese EVs to enter the markets. Why? Because more expensive simply means more profits for them. So this is not to say that I love China. What this is to say is that given adequate public support and research and funding and walking away from private market incentives, there is so much progress yet to be unlocked. China is still a capitalist country, but just because they decided to put in some public research, they could already improve 5 times better than us. Imagine what we could do under a socialist worker-controlled democracy. This is why we have to work for that. So, despite the fact that, and this is what they say, there is so much progress yet to be done, but we don't even need that. The little progress we've made is already enough if we can actually utilize it. In fact, it's enough to halt, as many researchers put it, the current research we already have, if were to be implemented, is enough to halt all climate change catastrophes that are currently being witnessed. Now, putting all this talk with EVs aside, with the proper funding, imagine what we could do in terms of public transport. Widespread public transportation that would not only be drastically more efficient, cheaper, and significantly reduce pollution, it would allow for cities to be better designed. Now, unlike modern-day urban cities where, depending on the city, somewhere between 20 to 50% of all land is spent on parking lots, we can have all that area be parks, be offices, be tailored to the people. So instead of prioritizing mass hunks of steel over the walkability and accessibility of cities, with the step away from privatized for-profit incentives, which currently lead the designing for cities, we could along with the reduction of pollution and action towards climate change, make our lives better and easier. Again, in harmony with the planet. To take, for example, the concept of solar punk, a society, I'm not sure, maybe you guys have heard of it, the concepts of a society focusing on connection with community and the planet. Oftentimes, this is considered an artistic, aesthetic ideal. This is entirely possible. This can be our reality. So the main point, this is not what I should be reading right now. So, one of the most important changes that we need as a starting step is education. Real education, breaking away from systems that indoctrinate us into thinking that climate change is an individual problem, that if you turn off the light before you leave the house, or if you somehow find 500,000 kroner to buy an EV, the world will become a better place. We need to step away from the system which indoctrinates us into these thoughts. The system which also indoctrinates us into thinking that if the market forces lead to 1 million people dying under starvation, that simply ought to be. That's, the invisible hand is so smart. If it led to that, that must be the will of God or some fucking crazy thing. So education is needed. And the kind of education that we need is one that must focus on empowering people with the knowledge of how the system works, the knowledge of what we truly are capable of, and the importance of politics. And let me be very clear here. When I say education, I'm not referring to programs similar to what exists today, where, for example, in 8th grade, everyone learns about climate change or whatever. No, that's just pointless. When everyone is already aware of those problems. So when I say real education, what I'm specifically referring to is class consciousness and awareness. The workers must be educated and informed of their struggle against capital. The workers must be educated and informed of their struggle against capital. I said that twice for some reason. And of the consequences that capital has had in society. And of the fundamental systemic crisis of capitalism. The role of this education I speak of must be one which serves the interest of the working people, championing the creation of a workers' revolutionary party, embodying their struggle against capital. Unlike the current educational system which we have that prioritizes teaching the neoclassical economics and whatever bullshit they say. And so, ultimately, I truly believe that with adequate awareness, no sane person would willingly choose to stay within the current system we have, with the exception, of course, being the capitalist elites who are profiting from it. So this is precisely why our work is so important, to raise awareness and to talk to people, working towards solidarity and unity among the workers. The fight for sustainable future, one where we all want to live, is a fight for all working people. Climate change disproportionately affects the poor, the working class, and communities that already are heavily suffering from capitalist imperialist exploitation. So it's the workers, regardless of identity, who suffer the most from polluted air, rising food prices, extreme weather events such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and economic instability, and so on. Hence why the utmost need for solidarity and unity among the workers. It is therefore important for all workers across industries, borders, identities to join the fight together against the capitalist system that is driving us towards a climate catastrophe. Now, worker solidarity has always been the foundation of any successful movement for change. The productive force, the productive power within society lies within the working people, and their power can only truly be realized and leveraged when united using their numbers in our collective ability to organize, strike, and demand change. The climate crisis is clearly a global one, needing international cooperation and solidarity. This is why workers everywhere, from miners in Bolivia to factory workers in China, teachers in the US, bus drivers in Sweden, all must organize and recognize that their struggle is interconnected against the international capital. It is precisely through this unity that we can build the mass movements necessary to overthrow capitalism and create a new society, one that is not only more sustainable, but values the humanity of humans. So the time for complacency is over. It is not enough to acknowledge that the problem, it's not enough to acknowledge the problem and to hope that somehow we will move away from it and that those in power will act. they want, they like what we live in right now. The wealthy and powerful have shown time and time again that they do not care about us. They care about one thing and one thing only: profits, even if it means disregarding the lives of millions of people along with the planet. It is up to us, the working people of the world, to rise up and demand change, multifaceted change. This is a direct call to action. We must awaken to our collective power. We must organize, educate, and fight. We must build the revolutionary party, where through mass uprisings and revolutions, we can build a new system, a socialist society, where workers control the means of production, where decisions are made democratically, in service of humanity, in harmony with the planet. And this is how we move forward towards a better society. What it takes is solidarity, education, and revolutionary action. Together, we can build a world that is not only sustainable, but also just and equitable for all. The time is now. Let's rise up and seize control.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have recorded it.